The small hut was immersed in the murmur of the silver silk waterfall. The only light came from a candle burned down to half its length, and the faint glow emanating from Julian's silk-transformed fingers. Alara sat across from him, her breathing steady, her eyes heavy with thought. The 3-meter distance between them in such a confined space had become suffocating. The black thread binding their wrists trembled whenever either of them moved. To see through this knot, we need resonance. Julian broke the silence. I can perceive its structure, but only a weaver's hands can feel the heartbeat of the one who created it. Alara nodded. She took out the silver shears, but this time, not to cut. She laid the blades flat, letting the thin black thread rest upon the cold metal. The silver shears were not merely a tool. They were a key to reality. When I begin, you must guide my sight, Alara instructed. Don't let me get lost in the illusions of dragon silk. Julian placed his still warm hand over Alara's hand holding the shears. They were close enough to feel each other's heartbeats through the thin silk of their clothing. Julian closed his eyes, focusing all his will on the point where their souls intersected. Begin, he whispered. Alara lightly flicked the black thread. A deep hum resonated, not heard with the ears, but vibrating directly through their bones. At once, the hut seemed to dissolve. In its place stretched an infinite space filled with countless strands of dragon silk, interwoven into a vast web like lattice. Within that network, they saw the wedding ceremony at Silken Gate once again. From this vantage, everything was clearer. They saw the king standing above, his lips moving as he murmured an ancient incantation. It had been him who directed the unnatural gust of wind, forcibly twisting 2 faded threads meant to run parallel into a single, dark knot. He never intended for us to mend history, Alara realized in horror within the vision. He wanted to create a filter knot. Every consequence of his excessive magic, every stain from preserving his rule, is being diverted into us. We are containers, meant to keep his own thread pristine and white. A tight pain seized Julian's chest. He saw his own thread already turning the color of white silk, being drained to sustain the throne. The price he had paid all his life as a disentangler was, in truth, the profit of the one in power. With every step we take, every moment we are close, Julian said, his voice echoing through the illusion. His magic draws harder. He wants to turn both of us into lifeless statues in his collection of fate. The shock of the vision snapped them back into reality. Alara staggered and fell into Julian's arms. The silver shears slipped from her hand and clattered onto the wooden floor. Both of them were gasping, sweat soaking their foreheads. Julian looked down at his wrist. The white silk had spread past his elbow, creeping toward his shoulder. He did not let go of Alara, but instead wrapped his arms around her, an instinctive, final act of protection from the last remnants of his humanity. "We don't have much time," Julian said, his voice low and trembling. "If the white silk reaches my heart, I'll disappear completely, and when that happens, the black knot will devour you as well." Alara looked up at him. In her eyes, there was no longer the cold calculation of an assassin. She raised her hand to his cheek, feeling the fragile warmth of life still there. "I won't let that happen," she said firmly. "We won't just unravel ourselves. We will reweave the fate of all Silken Gate." Outside, the waterfall continued to roar, but within them, a melody of rebellion had begun to be woven. The tremor of the vanished vision left behind a silence so heavy it pressed down on the small hut. Julian remained slumped against the wooden wall, his breathing ragged, while Alara still trembled from witnessing the truth behind the king. The black thread between them no longer glowed, but it was tightening, as if reacting to a disturbance in the flow of time itself. He's seen us," Julian whispered, his gray eyes dulled with exhaustion. That contact with the black thread wasn't just a glimpse of the past. It was an alarm sent straight to the throne. Alara clenched the silver shears in her hand. She could see the white silk creeping farther across Julian's shoulder, stiffening the muscles of his neck. He was disappearing before her eyes, piece by piece, to bear the consequences of another man's sins. "We can't stay," Alara said, rising and pulling Julian up with her. "If he's using us as a filter, then the only way to stop it is to destroy the funnel itself this very knot. You can't cut it, Alara," Julian warned, his voice hoarse. "I've seen thousands of outcomes. If you sever it now with the silver shears, the corruption will erupt and swallow all of Silken Gate. Reality itself will unravel like silk thrown into flame." Suddenly, strange beams of light pierced through the mist beyond the waterfall. They were not the flicker of ordinary torches. They were the glow of tracking threads, the most advanced detection magic of the crown. "They're here," Julian murmured. The hut's door was not broken down, it was unwoven, dissolved into splintered strands of wood by a specialized alchemical agent. A squad of guards clad in black silk armor stepped inside, led by the Marshal of Silverhold. He carried a decree woven in gold thread, the symbol of absolute authority. "Disentangle her, Julian." "Weaver Alara," the Marshal spoke, his tone flat and emotionless. "Your disappearance has caused a scar in the flow of dragon silk. His Majesty commands your immediate return to Silkhold to complete the restoration ritual." Alara stepped forward, shielding Julian with her body. "A restoration ritual? Or a chance for him to continue pouring poison into us?" The Marshal did not answer. He merely gestured. Instantly, the tracking threads tightened around them, forming a cage of light. Because the black thread bound them together, Julian and Alara were forced closer than ever, pressed together to avoid the cutting touch of the magical filaments. Julian tilted his head and whispered into Alara's ear, "Don't resist now. We need to get inside the palace. It is the only place that holds the primordial loom, the one thing that might let us reweave this knot properly." Alara met his gaze. In his eyes, she saw silent sacrifice and a trust steadily taking root. Slowly, she lowered the silver shears and concealed them within her cloak. "We will go," she declared, her voice firm. "But remember this. Once a weaver begins a new tapestry, no one can force her to pull the thread back to the beginning." They were escorted from the hut, passing through the roaring cascade of silver silk. Under the moonlight, the black thread binding their wrists suddenly flashed with the razor-thin streak of silver. It was the sign of a transformation the king had never anticipated, the consent of two souls bound in chains. The journey back to the palace began, carrying with it the promise of an inevitable clash between those who were controlled and the one who held the loom of power. The guard escort led Julian and Alara across the solitary suspension bridge into the palace. The bridge was woven from transparent strands of dragon silk, hanging between two sheer cliffs of Silken Gate. Below lay an abyss veiled in white mist, where small dragons spun silk, forming a shimmering sea of clouds. Julian staggered as he walked. His silk-transformed arm was no longer merely a numb white patch, it now radiated a bone-deep cold, creeping up toward his shoulder and reaching his collarbone. Every step felt unbearably heavy, as though he were dragging a massive gemstone behind him. Because of the black thread binding them, Alara was forced to stay close, supporting him. She wrapped an arm around Julian's waist, letting him rest part of his weight against her shoulder. "Don't push yourself," Alara whispered, her breath warm against his neck. "Lean on me. The guards will just think we're playing the part of an affectionate couple." Julian nodded faintly, his lips tinged with purple. He tried to move the fingers that still retained sensation, clutching at the edge of her garment. The black thread. "It's draining energy faster. The king is accelerating the filtering process." Ahead of them, the marshal walked calmly, his eyes occasionally flicking back to ensure the king's treasures remained intact. To the court, they were no longer people, but instruments of stability, a living version of dragon as currency. They entered the palace's glass corridor. Moonlight filtered through layers of translucent silk, casting strange patterns across the stone floor. In the stillness, their footsteps echoed sharply. Alara felt the knot at her wrist growing hot. A strange surge of emotion flowed from Julian into her, profound loneliness, and a terror of being completely erased. She tightened her grip on his hand, trying to send back warmth and resolve. "You won't disappear," she said softly, as fixed straight ahead. "I've woven the strongest fabrics in this valley. I'll reweave life itself for you if I have to." Julian turned his head slightly to look at her. In the dim light, she resembled a goddess of threads, both sharp and gentle. He realized that although they were bound by a dark conspiracy, her presence alone was what kept his mind from dissolving into the void. They stopped before the grand doors carved with colossal dragon heads. The marshal turned back and signaled the guards to withdraw. "The king awaits inside," he said in a cold, metallic voice. "Remember, every word and action you take will affect the survival of all Silken Gate. Do not tear the fabric of fate." The doors slowly opened, revealing a chamber filled with writhing black dragon silk surrounding a levitating throne. A crushing presence awaited them at the end of the corridor. Alara drew a deep breath and clasped Julian's icy, silk-formed hand. Together, they stepped forward, ready to face the one who held the loom and sought to decide their erasure. The grand hall within Silken Gate Palace bore none of the expected splendor of gold or jewels. Instead, it was draped in an uncanny darkness, layered with black silk ribbons cascading from the towering ceiling. The threads were not still. They stirred gently, as if breathing, drawing in what little light slipped through the narrow openings above. The king sat upon his throne, complex structure woven from dragon bone and core silk. He looked younger than Julian, yet buried deep within his eyes lay a weariness thousands of years old. "Come closer, children of fate." The king's voice flowed smoothly, cold as frost. The black thread at Julian's and Alara's wrists suddenly tightened, forcing them forward until they stood directly beneath the dragon days. The distance between them had shrunk to less than half a meter. Alara could feel the icy cold radiating from Julian's shoulder, now completely transformed into silk. He was trembling, yet he kept his spine rigidly straight. "Look at you." The king rested his chin on his hand, his gaze lingering on Julian's porcelain white arm. "What a beautiful sacrifice. You are becoming a masterpiece of Silken Gate, Julian. A disentangler dissolving into the very threads he once saved. This dissolution is theft, Your Majesty," Julian replied, his voice low but firm. "You used this knot to divert every magical consequence from the throne onto us." The king did not deny it. He rose and descended the steps of the dais. With each step, the black silk on the floor hissed softly, like serpents sliding across stone. "This world needs an anchor." The king stopped before them, then turned his gaze to Alara. "And you, weaver who carries the shears of rebellion, do you believe you can cut what I have woven? Those silver shears only work when the heart that wields them is frozen solid." "But I see." His lips curved faintly. "It is beginning to melt because of the man beside you." Alara clenched her fists, humiliation mixing with fear. She had not expected the king to sense the shift in her emotions through the vibrations of the black thread. "What do you want from us?" Alara demanded, her voice cold. "I want you to complete the final rite." The king raised his hand, and from the shadowed depths behind the throne emerged a colossal stone loom, the original loom. "Together, you will reweave the kingdom's source thread. If you succeed, Silken Gate will endure. If you fail, both of you will turn into silk dust and vanish forever into the void." As he spoke, the king swept his hand forward, releasing a crushing wave of pressure. Black threads coiled around Julian and Alara, lifting them into the air and drawing them toward the stone loom. Julian felt his breath catch. The porcelain white silk had begun to creep up his neck, making speech difficult. Amid the pain, he felt Elara's hand reach for his. Though his hand had lost all sensation, his soul still recognized her warmth. "Don't be afraid," Elara whispered, her eyes blazing with the resolve he had never seen before. "We'll weave an ending he could never imagine." What had once been enforced closeness a punishment now became their only refuge against the overwhelming force of the crown. They hung suspended before the ancient loom, where the threads of fate began to turn, preparing for the most terrifying exchange yet. Before them, the original loom loomed like a living entity of stone and light. The most ancient silk dragons larger than their kin circled the frame, spinning radiant golden threads that carried the breath of decay. This was the source of all prosperity in Silken Gate, and also the vessel of the dynasty's darkest secrets. "Begin," the king's voice echoed from behind them, cold and insistent. "Reweave the source thread. If you do not, the entire valley will dissolve into the void before dawn breaks." Julian hung suspended by coils of black thread, his vision dimming. The white silk had crept to his jaw, leaving his face like a half-finished bust. He forced his gaze to the loom. Through a disentangler's sight, he saw millions of threads tangled in chaos, and at the center of it all, a hollow that was draining the kingdom's lifeblood. "You see it, don't you, Julian?" Elara whispered. She stood close beside him, her hands resting on the ancient beams of the loom. "Don't weave, Elara." Julian struggled to form the words. "He's deceiving us. If you finish this tapestry, I will vanish completely, becoming the core of the loom. He will gain immortality, and you will be imprisoned here forever to maintain it." Elara froze. Her hands trembled over the golden threads. She looked at the king, smiling in triumph. Then she turned back to Julian. A single tear slipped down her cheek and fell onto his porcelain white hand. In that moment, Elara made a choice beyond every script of fate. She did not weave as the king commanded. Instead, she drew the silver shears. "What are you doing?" the king roared, his composure shattering. "I will not reweave your lies," Elara declared. She did not cut the source thread. Instead, she used the silver shears to sever the black knot binding her wrist to Julian's. It was a mad act, for by the laws of this world, cutting a forced fate knot would trigger a catastrophic rupture of reality. But Elara did not cut with hatred. She cut with voluntary sacrifice. A surge of silver light erupted, brighter than the sun. The shockwave shook the entire grand hall. The black silks cascading from the ceiling were torn apart. The black knot vanished, but rather than freeing them cleanly, it left an eternal scar of light on both their wrists. Julian collapsed onto the stone floor, his breathing slowly returning as the silkification halted abruptly. Half his body remained white silk, but its spread had been stopped. The price, however, was devastating. A long crack split the original loom. The radiant golden threads dulled, fading into pale gray. The monetary guarantee of the entire kingdom had just been shaken to its core. The king stumbled back, his face suddenly marked by the true wrinkles of time. You've torn the fabric of the entire kingdom." Guards surged in from all sides. Julian forced himself upright and grasped Elara's hand. Though no invisible bond held them now, they stood close. The 3-meter distance was no longer a shackle, but a silent promise. "Run," Julian said, his eyes alight with a new hope amid the ruins. They sprinted toward the vast windows of the grand hall and hurled themselves into the treacherous night of the valley below, leaving behind a throne and fracture and a world order freshly torn apart. Act 1 ends in the crash of broken laws, opening a journey with no path back. A bitter wind from the highlands cut sharply across their faces as Julian and Elara stopped at a rocky outcrop hidden behind a waterfall of silver silk. In the distance, Silken Gate Palace still stood tall, but its usual radiant golden aura had been replaced by a dull, lifeless gray. Alara leaned against the stone wall, her chest rising and falling. She lifted her wrist and examined it. The black thread was gone, leaving only a thin scar like a strand of silver light circling her wrist, shimmering strangely in the dark. She turned to look at Julian. He sat slumped on the ground, breathing heavily. Half of his face and his right arm were still porcelain white silk, cold and unmoving. Though the transformation had stopped, that part of him had not returned to flesh. He looked like an ancient statue shattered in half, both hauntingly beautiful and painfully tragic. "Are you all right?" Alara stepped closer, reaching out to place a hand on his shoulder. But when her hand was only centimeters away, Julian pulled back slightly. "Don't touch that side. I can't feel anything there. It will only give you the cold of lifeless matter." Alara froze, her hands trembling. Freedom from the black knot had given them bodily autonomy, yet it had raised another invisible wall. She was no longer bound to stay within 3 meters of him, but in that moment, she realized she had no desire to leave him at all. "We did it," Alara said, trying to redirect the moment. "The king has aged. I saw the wrinkles on his face. He's no longer immortal, but the cost is this entire kingdom," Julian replied, gesturing toward the valley. Under the rising dawn, a horrifying sight unfolded. The dragon silk fields that once shimmered like diamonds were dulling. The small silk dragons flew in chaotic patterns, their cries sounding like threads snapping apart. With the original loom cracked, the world's currency had begun to lose its value. Prosperity was unraveling. "This collapse is necessary to build something real," Alara said with conviction. She sat beside him and, this time, voided the white silk flesh. Instead, she took his left hand, the one that still held warmth. Julian stiffened. He looked at their interlaced fingers. It was the first time they had touched without magical coercion or the fear of imminent death. A gentle warmth stirred within him, followed immediately by a sharp ache. He knew that as the world began to fade, the king would unleash the most ruthless purge yet to reclaim those who had torn the fabric of royal power. They were no longer just fugitives. They now carried within them the seeds of truth. "We need to go deeper into the region of Silverhold," Julian said, his voice steady again. "They're ancient weavers there long forgotten. Only they know how to mend this world without sacrificing souls." Alara nodded. She stood and helped him rise. Though the black thread was gone, they moved in perfect rhythm, as if they had always belonged together. The sky along the horizon was no longer radiant gold, but a vast expanse of silver gray. A new chapter had begun where love took root amid the ruins, and new secrets waited to be woven from the fragments of the past.